Greetings car fanatics, thanks for tuning in for another video. Unfortunately, in this video I'll be sharing some bad news. I messed up my wife's Mercedes C250. In this video I'll show you how I attempted to fix an oil leak on my wife's car and how it went wrong. Let's go ahead and take a look at the footage. Alright, so I'm noticing oil residue on the alternator. Just below it you can see there's oil residue on the plastic splash guard. I also had a bunch of oil on these hoses, but I cleaned off the engine bay to make it easier to trace the source of the leak. As far as I can tell, the oil leak is coming from either above the alternator or behind it. First, we're going to remove the plastic engine cover by simply pulling it off. Then we have to remove this plastic shroud at the front so we can get a better view of the engine. It's held on by a few clips that you'll have to pry. With these things off, we're ready to remove the intake tube. There are a few hose clamps and hoses that you'll need to remove to disconnect the intake tube. Okay, so now we have the intake tube off and we have a much better view of the engine. Unfortunately, however, I still don't have a good idea of where the leak is coming from. I'm going to have to remove the alternator so we can see what's behind it. But before we do that, let's disconnect the battery since we're taking out the alternator and we don't want to mess with the electrical system while the battery is still plugged in. With the battery disconnected, we're ready to remove the alternator. It's just held on by 4 E12 bolts. However, we do have to remove the drive belt. To do this, you'll need a breaker bar and a T55 Torx bit. We just have to release some tension from the drive belt tensioner. We can then remove the drive belt from the alternator, and that's going to allow us to pull the alternator out. Alright, that was pretty easy to get the belt off. I won't show you the rest of the footage of removing the alternator because it was pretty hard to film, but in a nutshell, you just remove the 4 E12 bolts, a clip, and an electric wire that's connected to the alternator, and that's all you really need to do. And while I wasn't filming, I ended up messing up the engine. Let me explain what happened. I found a potential source of the oil leak right next to the alternator. It is the freeze plug, which basically allows the coolant to expand in case it freezes over so you don't mess up your engine block. I realized that the plug wasn't on straight, so I decided to knock it straight with a hammer just to make sure that it would be flush and keep any oil from coming out of the engine. I realized the plug wasn't on straight, which could be causing the leak, so I decided to use a hammer to knock the freeze plug straight. And the freeze plug is actually kept in place via compression. So it is a compression fit that keeps a nice tight seal with the engine. During the process, I hit the freeze plug too many times with a hammer, and it actually shot inside the engine and fell under some internal engine component. Now keep in mind that the freeze plug is only a little bit more than 1 inch in diameter. So I have a 1 inch diameter hole on the side of my engine. The freeze plug went in there. At this point, I'm really freaking out because the only way to take out the freeze plug would be to tear apart the engine just to get to it. If I were to have a shop do this, it would probably be a couple $1,000s probably to get this fixed. So after freaking out for a few days, I devised a strategy to use tweezers to get a grip of the freeze plug, and then from there I would try to get locking pliers to pull it out. Now it was really difficult to use tweezers and get a hold of the freeze plug and get it into a position where I could get the locking pliers on. But after several hours of tinkering, I was finally able to get the locking pliers on, and through sheer force I pulled the freeze plug out through the hole, and the freeze plug got really bent up in the process. Anyway, I am so relieved I was able to get the freeze plug out, because if I didn't do this, it would have been a couple $1,000s probably to get this fixed, and my wife would have been really pissed off at me. With all this said, I actually think the oil leak wasn't even coming from the freeze plug, so this is something I just messed up unnecessarily. Later, I did notice that there was oil on my intake tube. As you can see here, there's a turbo coupling that goes inside the intake tube. It's covered in oil and it's also deformed. So I actually think the oil leak was coming from here rather than the freeze plug. But anyways, I did order a new turbo hose coupling, which runs about $25. If you need one, I'll add a link in the description for anyone who needs it. In addition, I did order a new freeze plug so I could undo the damage I caused. And while I'm at it, I figure I might as well change out the timing belt as well because it does have about 65,000 miles on it. So it's been about a week later and I now have all the parts. Let's go ahead and put everything back, starting with the freeze plug, then the alternator, and then the timing belt. With that done, the only things left are to reinstall the new turbo intake coupling, the intake tube, and the plastic engine covers. So the car is all put back together after sitting for about a week. This is the moment of truth. Let's see if she'll start up. Okay, so everything sounds perfect, but we won't be able to tell right away if the oil leak has been fixed. For that, we're going to have to give it a little more time to see if the oil leak returns. Okay, so it's been about a week since I put the car back together. My wife's been driving the car for the past week. Let's go ahead and see if there are any oil leaks. Before, I would notice oil residue on the plastic splash guard, but as we can see here, everything looks perfectly dry. So this is super wonderful. I think I fixed the oil leak. I am super happy. Well, there you have it, car fanatics. In this video, you were able to see how I messed up my wife's car, and fortunately, I was able to fix the problem. But this was definitely one of the most difficult and most stressful DIY jobs I've ever done on a particular car. I definitely want to avoid this going forward. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Leave me questions or comments below.